Dan's Grandpa by Sally Morgan. Dan stared into the still water of the rock hole and thought about his grandpa. It had been 6 months since his grandpa had died. Dan really missed him. He had never had a dad, so his grandpa was very, very important to him. When Dan was sad, he liked to escape to the bush, where he could sit quietly with his animal friends and remember Grandpa. Dan loved to remember all the special things he and Grandpa had done together. Grandpa loved fishing. His favourite spot was down in the mangroves where the big turtles came in. Once, when Dan and Grandpa had been mangrove fishing, the tide had come in very quickly. In their hurry to get away, Dan had got stuck in the mud. Grandpa had pulled him out and carried him to safety. Grandpa had taught Dan a lot about the bush, about the birds, plants and animals. It was in the bush that Grandpa sang songs to Dan in Nga. Dan knew that there were many Aboriginal languages in Australia and they were all special. Dan was learning to speak Nga himself. It was Grandpa who had taught Dan to dance. Grandpa had been a very good dancer in his day. He would sing an old clobbery song and tell Dan where to put his feet so that he made the right steps. At night when it was cool, Grandpa and Dan liked to sit on the veranda and talk about the old days when Grandpa was a boy. Grandpa also told Dan stories about the stars. Dan loved to look at the night sky. But one day, Grandpa had become very sick and he had to be taken to hospital. At school, Dan couldn't concentrate at all. He was too worried and just kept thinking about Grandpa. Every afternoon after school, Dan would run all the way to the hospital. Grandpa was happy to see him. He had lollies hidden under his pillow. "Don't worry, Dan," Grandpa said one day. "No matter what happens, I'll always be with you, looking after you." One day, Dan's mum picked him up from school at lunchtime. Dan knew something was terribly wrong, but he was too scared to ask. At home, his mum told him that Grandpa had gone to be with all their other old relatives. Grandpa's last words had been to tell Dan not to worry. The next day, Dan got up early and sat on the veranda on his own. He felt really miserable. His mum brought him out a warm drink and some toast. Dan broke a little piece of toast off and called for Cocky. Grandpa had spoilt her with toast and honey. Dan called and called, but Cocky didn't come. Dan and his mum searched everywhere for Cocky. They were very upset. Cocky had been Grandpa's special bird. "Oh, Mum," Dan said, "Cocky's gone too. She's gone with Grandpa." Even now, 6 months later, Dan could feel a tear sliding down his cheek as he thought of Cocky and Grandpa. He closed his eyes and he put his head on his knees. Suddenly, there was a loud screech in the air. Dan's dog barked and jumped up, whining and wagging his tail. Dan looked up. From high in a tree, Cocky swooped down and landed awkwardly on Dan's shoulder. She nibbled Dan's cheek, then screeched so loudly his ears hurt. Dan looked at her in amazement. She screeched again, and Dan understood what she was saying. "Don't worry, Dan. Don't worry." "Oh, Grandpa," Dan laughed. "Now I know you're still looking after me." The end.